Oh my god, that man just shot someone! Someone get the police! Wait, that's the policeman right over there. He's watching and clapping? How can this be legal? You'd be shocked to discover just what crazy things used to be legal. Smoking everywhere. You can't believe it. That woman 3 rows in front of you in the movie theater just lit up a cigarette. It's stinking up the whole place. This will not do, so you quickly flag down an usher. And within minutes, the woman is escorted out of the theater, yelling that she has her rights. It's going to take a while for that smell to dissipate, but at least it's better than it used to be. Smoking tobacco and other products used to be just a part of life. No one had any idea about the negative health connotations, and those who started usually got addicted pretty quickly. Taverns and public houses were usually full of smoke, and anyone who told someone to stop was more likely to have bigger problems than secondhand smoke. When smoking bans finally began, it was not where you'd expect. The first known smoking ban was by the Roman Catholic Church in Mexico in 1575, and only 15 years later Pope Urban VII banned it in all church buildings. Smoking bans around the world were scattershot, with one Ottoman sultan eventually making smoking punishable by death. These were largely based around personal taste. If someone hated the smell of smoke and they had the power to ban it, they just might do it. But they came and went with the whims of the monarch. It wasn't until 1876 when smoking was banned in a specific building, the New Zealand government's historic base, because it was mostly a wood building and they feared fires. But it was common to just be able to smoke casually in most buildings, and the first serious bans came from an unlikely source. At the dawn of the 20th century, smoking was still generally legal in offices, restaurants, and even universities. But in Nazi Germany, the leadership saw it as a vice and spread anti-tobacco campaigns for the duration of the regime. They also banned smoking in all government buildings. You don't want people distracted by tobacco when they could be committing genocide, I guess. But as the 20th century wore on, scientists got more vocal about the health effects of smoking, and secondhand smoke in particular. More and more buildings started asking people not to smoke or putting in non-smoking areas. But those weren't always as effective, and everyone seated 5 feet away from the smoking section knows this. Things went fast and furious after that. It was 1975 when Minnesota passed the first Clean Indoor Air Act, which required restaurants to have non-smoking areas. After that, cities were banning smoking entirely, starting with Aspen, Colorado. Pretty soon, smokers felt like an endangered species. The areas where smoking was allowed indoors were shrinking by the day. Offices, public transportation, even bars were soon off limits in many places. Even the outdoors weren't completely safe. Some cities banned smoking on beaches and in public parks. Today, people can generally breathe free and the laws get stricter all the time. Public health experts are happy and smoking is decreasing every year due to the high costs and limited options, but that lady still insists that she has her rights. It's not the only harmful activity that used to be legal. Distracted driving. The roads used to be the Wild West in a lot of ways. Cars aren't much more than 100 years old, but that didn't stop those using the roads from causing some chaos. After all, it doesn't matter if you're hit by a Ferrari, a covered wagon, or a racing horse, it still hurts like heck, if you're lucky. But with roads used irregularly, there was little need for laws governing them. If someone got hit by someone's vehicle, it was unlikely the authorities would take their side, especially if the person steering the wagon had more money than the peasant walking along the side of the road, which they probably did. And the authorities especially weren't that interested in what they were doing while driving. But that was about to change. With the creation of the automobile, people were soon able to move faster and hit harder. There began to be more accidents involving cars hitting pedestrians, but getting prosecuted for them was a spotty affair. Between jaywalking laws and the lack of surveillance in the early 20th century, it was more likely for these cases to be a civil affair. Even drunk driving was legal for a long time, but that's been cracked down on heavily. Distracted driving is another affair because it's hard to define. What was distracting drivers during the early days of driving? Maybe the kids are acting up. Maybe they're trying to have a bite of a hot dog. Maybe that man on the radio said something really funny. They could all have tragic consequences, but nothing compared to what was coming. A distracted driver was likely to be fined if they were driving carelessly and a policeman saw them. If they killed a person in a crash and were known to be reckless, they might go to jail. But the police still weren't very interested in the distracted driving itself, just the consequences. Then came the cell phones. Sure, at the start they were big blocky things that only took phone calls. The horror. But it was still very easy to get distracted by a work call while driving. And then came smartphones, with their 10 kinds of communication and their flashy graphics, and suddenly teenagers everywhere were texting and driving, and crashes were increasing fast. Something had to be done. According to studies, the most risky activities while driving are calling on a phone, reaching for an object, or texting. Parents were worried about their children, drivers were worried about their safety, and it wasn't long before the government got involved. Today, text messaging is banned in 41 states while driving, and 39 states have specific laws banning distracted driving. These laws aren't nearly as harsh as the ones regarding drunk driving, but getting caught can still carry a nasty fine, and an accident while distracted can bring harsher penalties. Has it worked? Not exactly. While the law in New York caused usage to drop, it soon went back up. So keep your eyes on the road. Surprisingly, one of the most controversial topics in today's United States used to be no big deal: open immigration. Back when the United States was first founded, they weren't exactly spoiled for people, and they were surrounded by empires, so it's not a surprise that the first take on the U.S. Constitution was pretty welcoming to immigrants. While coming to the United States wasn't particularly tricky, you just needed to pay your way onto a boat and make your way across the Atlantic, becoming a citizen was more difficult. Only white people of good moral character were eligible for naturalization, and the time you had to be a resident and stay in the government's good graces kept going up. Still, if you wanted to head on over and start that clock, it was about as easy as it would get. But things would get a little thornier in the 19th century. The government kept on revising the laws around naturalization, including finally allowing black people to be naturalized, but not until 1870. While immigrants from all around the world were welcome, many, like the Chinese immigrants who came to work on the railroads, were never eligible to become citizens. But as the ports kept getting more crowded with waves of immigration from both Europe and Asia, many Americans started looking disdainfully at their new potential neighbors. After all, they weren't the good kind of immigrants like their parents. Something clearly had to be done, and the Page Act passed in 1875. It was the first step. It became the first law to restrict immigration to the United States, banning those deemed undesirable. Things would only get more restrictive from there. These initial laws were designed to target a specific group: East Asian immigrants, as well as anyone suspected of being likely to be a prostitute. This was mostly a way to deny Asian women their way into the country, and it escalated into a law banning Chinese immigration almost completely in 1882. As the 20th century dawned, the federal government realized that letting states handle the naturalization process was a problem, and they federalized it, complete with new immigration quotas. This became tragically significant in the 1940s when waves of Jewish immigrants from the countries occupied by Nazi Germany were denied entry, with most of them eventually being sent back to die in the Holocaust. And the issues over immigration haven't gotten any easier since. It seems like the U.S. can't go a few weeks without a fight over immigration. National origin quotas were eliminated in the 1950s, and the 1980s saw laws to make it easier for refugees to apply for asylum in the U.S. But while the primary method of immigration in the 18th and 19th century was the ports, now eyes were turning to the southern border. Porous, in the best of times, it led to many Mexican citizens coming to the United States in search of work, with many just staying here off book. This is technically a crime, and it's impossible for them to apply for citizenship with only a few exceptions. While some may say it's time to build that wall, many others say it's just time for a complete overhaul of immigration laws. Again, this next one might just bum out the kids. Kids dropping out of school. How many times did you tell your mom, "I'm not going to school anymore, I'm just going to stay at home and play games all day"? Sure enough, you probably found yourself on the bus anyway. But not that long ago, it was perfectly acceptable for kids to never go to school. In fact, it was probably the norm in most places. While compulsory education did have its roots as far back as ancient Greece, the ideas of philosophers like Plato took a long time to catch on. One of the first places to have mandatory school was Sparta. But it wasn't the type of school we think of today. It was a military academy, and the elementary school-age boys were engaging in brutal training to prepare them for military service and citizenship. For the most part, parents were largely responsible for teaching their children, and it would take a long time for this practice to become popular. The first society to have compulsory schooling for everyone, boys and girls, is actually a surprise. It was the Aztecs. But across the pond in Europe, it was a very different story. Most schools were elite institutions that charged tuition, and most poor parents not only didn't have the money, they needed their kids back home. Parents taught their kids what they needed to know to run the farm or help out in the business, and they were put to work. But the Protestant Reformation brought change to Europe, and one of their big platforms was the establishment of compulsory education. This started in elementary school and spread through Europe and the United States. Soon, almost every district had their own state-run school. But establishing this new norm wouldn't be without its bumps. The Puritans, who established themselves in the United States, had a passion for learning, but it had to be balanced with the practicalities of life. This often meant students learned all day and then came home and started working on the farm. Puts your after-school job at Dairy Queen into perspective. This also meant that after a certain amount of time, usually primary school, learning was over and it was off to work. As time went on, this became the norm, and higher education was still paid for by most people. While the wealthy went to college, the working class went back and joined the family trade. But the benefit of 6 or more years of schooling often made them better at their job. Soon enough, things changed again. The Industrial Revolution reduced the need for child labor, and laws passed that made it easier for kids to enjoy their childhood. And this meant more school! While it's common for students to be taken out of school as young as 11 or 12, Now, most countries required students to attend well into high school. Some countries, like Israel or India, won't allow students to drop out until they're adults. In the United States, it varies by state, but the youngest is 15, with the exception of kids with a religious exemption like the Amish, which are only required to attend through 8th grade. And today, only 5 countries don't have compulsory education laws, and one of them, Vatican City, just doesn't have any kids to teach. You might hear the banjo sounds playing with this next one. Incest? Sorry, Billy. Can't marry Cousin Angie, no matter if you gave her a ring made out of dandelion stems at that family reunion. But surprisingly, the taboo against incest wasn't always as strong as it is today. The first laws about incest date back to ancient China, but they weren't exactly scientific. Cousins couldn't marry if they shared the same last name, but they could if they had the other side's surname. But in other societies, incest was a lot more common, and it all came back to the royal families because who could tell them that something they were doing was illegal? They decided what was illegal, and if a pharaoh in ancient Egypt wanted to marry and have kids with his sister, who was going to stop him? And as civilization marched on, so did the not-so-forbidden love. It's not known how common it was, but evidence still exists of families in Greece and Rome where husbands and wives were also brother and sister. There were even several marriages between the Ptolemaic queen Cleopatra and her brothers, but even in ancient times, there were people saying these relationships were, well, just wrong. The ancient Greek playwright Sophocles famously wrote about the tragic King Oedipus, whose romantic tryst with his mom drove him to insanity. But what was keeping it from being a bigger taboo? In many high-ranking families, especially the royals, they were focused on making sure their kids married someone from an equally renowned family. And what better choice than your own? But things were about to change. Marriage between related royals continued into the Middle Ages, although it was much less common for them to be close relatives. Instead, the royal families became mostly composed of unions between distant relatives, distant enough that it wasn't uncomfortable, but close enough that you were keeping things in the favored family. But another factor was entering the picture: religion. Christianity, in particular Protestantism, had strong opinions about what was going on in the bedroom. And as the Puritans and other religious groups headed to the US, it was a chance to create a new society with rules that weren't set by royal families that had been in power for hundreds of years. So, what did things look like today? In the United States, incest is largely prohibited. It's criminalized between consenting adults in all but 2 states, Rhode Island and New Jersey. But where it gets a little trickier is with first cousins. Are they close enough for there to be a serious risk of inbreeding if they get married? Scientists say yes, although it's much reduced from, say, siblings. And the US largely lets the states have their own say, so anyone looking to marry their cousin should brush up on that state map. It's illegal in the majority of states, although only 8 states make it a criminal offense in some circumstances. 5 states allow it, but only if one party in the marriage is infertile. This next one might shock you, or if you're an American, outrage you. Killing a bald eagle. The bald eagle, the majestic national bird of the United States. Not only is it a national icon, but the bird of prey is one of the most protected animals in the world. Even before settlers came to the United States, it had a special role for Native Americans. Their feathers, much like the feathers of the golden eagle, were considered to be sacred artifacts. Many Native Americans believe eagles bring messages from the gods to humans, and it's common for dropped feathers to be used in religious rituals. And they weren't the only ones who appreciated the majestic bird. When the United States was founded, the Continental Congress decided to make that native bird front and center on the Great Seal of the United States. But surprisingly, all this respect didn't mean much to the bird. Bald eagles are big birds, and big birds make great trophies. During the early days of the United States, it was pretty common for them to be hunted. They didn't exactly make great eating. Carnivore species usually don't taste too great, but their feathers were prized, and many hunters would love to have them displayed on their wall. It started taking its toll on their population, and Congress eventually acted. First came the Migratory Bird Treaty of 1918, which included the bald eagle in a law that made it illegal to hunt, capture, or kill over 1,000 species of migratory birds. It also gave protection to any object taken from them, including their feathers, which reduced the incentive to secretly kill them. But surprisingly, their biggest challenge was still ahead. In 1940, Congress passed a second act specifically to protect the bald eagle and increase the penalty for anyone who kills the national bird or illegally possesses its parts. So why was the population still declining faster than ever? It was a mystery, and one that scientists managed to crack. The problem wasn't that bald eagles were being killed. The adult specimens were surviving at a high rate. The problem was that they were never being born. The culprit? The pesticide DDT, which interfered with their ability to metabolize calcium. Not only did this reduce their fertility, but many of the eggs they laid had thin eggshells and weren't able to sustain life. Shockingly, by the 1950s, there were less than 500 nesting pairs of bald eagles on the continental US. Additionally, they were being killed in large numbers by hunters in Alaska who thought the birds would hurt their livestock. But today, things are very different. DDT was banned for a number of reasons, and with its departure, the bald eagle population started to recover. It eventually went from the brink of extinction to not even being classified as endangered now. But don't count on being able to put bald eagle drumsticks on the menu anytime soon. The laws protecting them are strict as ever. Hunting them is still banned. Any accidental killings by power lines or windmills have to be reported to the federal government, and the possession of their feathers is limited only to members of official Native American tribes. It's banned to keep them for falconry in the US, and keeping them in captivity requires a permit. So if you see the national bird, the best approach is probably just leave it alone. This one will have many high school kids in mourning. Underage drinking. You're kicking back, having a good time at a party, when all of a sudden the cops pull up. You and your friends try to ditch the beer, but it's no use. Your parents will be picking you up from the police station. The cops keep ruining a good time. But it didn't always used to be this way. For centuries, the drinking laws regarding minors were, well, they didn't really used to have any. Not only were kids free to have a sip of wine or beer in their homes if their parents were okay with it, but it wasn't like the taverns were going to check ID. And a big part of this was not only weren't teenage drinking laws really a thing, teenagers really weren't either. Most kids above 13 were out of school and working, and if they needed a little beer to relax after a day in the factory, most people did not care. But sooner or later, things had to change. The main culprit was, yeah, you guessed it, the Puritans. Those guys really know how to ruin a good time. As the US was in its earliest days, it was still common to have teenage soldiers in the military fighting the British, and they would share some ale with the other soldiers with no one batting an eye. But once the ink dried on the Constitution, attention started shifting to smaller problems. Many Protestants had been advocating against excessive drinking for a while, and people were starting to become more aware of just how excess of drink can influence a person. And now that they weren't fighting a war, drunk Uncle Tommy was becoming a problem. Many states still didn't have legal drinking ages, and those that passed it made it 18 or 21. But soon it was about to become infinity. In 1919, the federal government, driven by an unusual union of conservative activists opposed to public drunkenness and feminists who believe alcohol made men more dangerous to women, passed the 19th Amendment, banning the sale of alcohol nationwide. The Prohibition era was a failure, to put it lightly. It drove alcohol consumption underground and lasted 14 years. Organized crime was booming, and in an era where drinking alcohol could get you arrested, teenage drinking was the least of anyone's concerns. By the time it was finally repealed, the US was in the middle of the Great Depression, and World War II was coming. Teen drinking remained a state issue, and some states even lowered their drinking age so that soldiers coming back from the war could legally get a drink. But those days were about to come to a screeching halt. So, why is there now a hard ban on anyone under the age of 21 drinking in the US, with few exceptions for religious consumption of wine? It all comes back to drunk driving. It became a scourge in the 70s, and many states responded by raising the drinking age. But in 1984, the feds took it out of their hands. The National Minimum Drinking Age Act penalized any state that didn't raise their drinking age to 21 by cutting their highway funding, and eventually all 50 states complied. This remains controversial, as many volunteer soldiers can't have a beer to take the edge off in between deployments. But it's not going anywhere, so many kids are getting those fake IDs ready. IR adult. Looks convincing. This next one will make dudes who make "take my wife, please" jokes a little nervous. Polygamy. For most people, marriage is a sacred bond between two individuals to love each other for all the rest of their lives. But for some people, it's more like chasing Pokemon. Gotta catch 'em all. The idea of polygamy, or having more than one wife at the same time, dates back to ancient times, and naturally, it was often the ruler deciding to do it. After all, if the king decides he wants 10 wives, who's going to tell him it's illegal? In extreme circumstances, the many wives of the king would have their own quarters, and he'd just pick his favorite every night to share his bed. This was common in societies where there were more women than men around, often when many men had died in a war. But it didn't stay in ancient times. Historically, many religions allowed polygamy under certain circumstances. Both Islam and Hinduism lay out the requirements for men to marry more than once, and the Jewish Bible orders the king to not take too many wives. So more than one is okay, but don't get greedy. The early exception was Christianity, which condemned polygamy. This continued into the development of Protestant sects, and the practice started to lose its popularity. A big part of the decline wasn't religious but natural. Populations were increasing, life expectancy was rising, and the need for polygamy was decreasing. The motivation for men taking many wives was often to have more children, multiple in a year. But this idea didn't die out so easily. Most countries in the West outlawed polygamy by the 20th century, but it kept on popping up. In Nazi Germany, Heinrich Himmler looked out at the mass number of soldiers who were dying in the war, and he thought that there had to be a solution to the lack of men for women to marry. No, not stop the pointless war they were waging on in Europe, don't be crazy. He and Martin Bormann proposed allowing men to have multiple wives if they applied for the privilege. It didn't go anywhere, likely due to them losing the war, and no one listening to them anymore. But a much bigger dispute was forming across the Atlantic. When the religion of Mormonism was founded in the 19th century, founder Joseph Smith claimed to have a revelation from God that told him to bring back plural marriage. Many fundamentalist Mormons took multiple wives in defiance of state laws in the U.S., and the U.S. didn't take to it very well. Joseph Smith was killed by a mob in 1844 as part of a wave of anti-Mormon violence and a battle among Mormon sects for the right to practice polygamy waged for almost 200 years until the Supreme Court ruled against them in 2013. But what about the ladies? Polyandry, the practice of having more than one husband, is much rarer than the alternative and is largely only allowed in small tribal communities. This is usually a way to limit population growth when there are few resources and is outlawed in virtually all countries today. But this next one might make men squeeze their legs together: castration and sterilization. It's the worst thing any boy can feel, that pain when you get kicked in the balls. But hey, at least they're still there. Not so much for those unfortunate souls who have had their testicles removed surgically, the practice of castration. Today, it usually only happens to those unfortunate pets who get into the car thinking they're going on a ride, but come back wearing an embarrassing cone minus a few key parts. But in history, it was not only allowed to be done to people as punishment for crimes, including treason and angering the ruler, but it was sometimes done voluntarily to those who accepted it as a job requirement. Wait, what? Why would anyone volunteer to lose their family jewels? Life was hard back then, and sometimes a sacrifice had to be made. Particularly for strong men, the decision to become a eunuch, someone who had been castrated, had its perks. Kings often used eunuchs to guard their women's quarters because a male soldier without testicles was the only person who could be trusted to protect the king's wives, while also not being tempted to sneak in there and try to seduce them. And as time moved on, there were other opportunities as well. The Catholic Church needed male singers who could reach a certain high pitch, and testosterone wasn't helpful with that. So while the church didn't castrate anyone personally for the job, being a castrato could get you a plum job in the Vatican's choir. But there was an even darker side to this painful practice. Even into the modern era, castration was practiced as a punishment for a crime and often cited as the humane option. Thomas Jefferson proposed a bill reducing the penalty for sexually related crimes to castration from death, but it never passed. Even as recently as 2016, an Alabama lawmaker tried to introduce this back to society. But most infamously, British scientist Alan Turing, who helped save the world during World War II, was rewarded for this by having his homosexuality outed and being convicted of gross indecency. As part of his sentence of probation, he was required to undergo injections that would render him impotent. This is considered one of the greatest shames of Britain in the early 20th century. But many of the other victims of this kind of treatment are anonymous. Starting in the 1890s, the United States government had one of the world's first widespread sterilization programs. While this process was less bloody than castration typically was, usually using surgery to eliminate fertility but keep sexual function intact, it targeted a wide range of mentally ill, disabled, and institutionalized people. This even included people who were deaf or had physical deformities, and many were living in institutions where they had no one to advocate for them. After the events of World War II, when the Nazis' even larger eugenics program was exposed, the public mood shifted firmly against mandatory sterilization, and the practice was eventually kicked into the dustbin of history in most places. But one procedure haunts the history of institutions even more: lobotomies. So what's the best way to handle a mentally ill person whose behavior is disruptive? Therapy? Medication? Well, if you ask people from 70 years ago, they might just say, just stab them in the brain. It sounds barbaric, but at the time it was actually considered a massive leap forward in mental health. The state of mental asylums at the time was not great. While some very early examples in places like Egypt had surprisingly modern techniques like music therapy, most mental institutions were nicknamed nut houses, which were more a place to keep people contained than to help them in any way. It was common to keep people restrained and just lock them up far away from where they could bother anyone. But in the 1930s, one Portuguese neurologist had a radical suggestion. The lobotomy is a short procedure, but it has radical consequences. It uses a sharp tool to sever connections in the brain's prefrontal cortex, radically affecting the way the brain functions. Initially, the procedure required the drilling of a hole in the skull and was a complex operation, but a later change allowed it to be performed through one of the eyes, which also held the risk of costing the patient vision in that eye, but that was the least of the concerns. The procedure was also known for rendering the violently mentally ill patient placid and compliant, although many of them were so severely affected that they had to be institutionalized afterward. After all, the brain is a complicated organ, and you can't just hit it with a sharp object and do a factory reset. So naturally, the public rejected this procedure, right? Not quite. Across the world, it became seen as an easy, safe way to handle the mentally ill by many people. Antonio Egas Moniz even shared the Nobel Prize for Medicine in 1949 for his role in developing it, and it quickly became the go-to procedure for psychiatric hospitals to keep patients under control. A total of 40,000 patients were lobotomized in the US alone, although other countries were much slower to adopt it. Even more disturbing, not all the patients who had the procedure were mentally ill. Many were troublesome girls who were brought in for the procedure not by the doctors but by their parents. In fact, almost 2/3 of the victims of this procedure were women, and one case would shock the world and bring an end to its prevalence. Most of the victims of lobotomy were anonymous, but that wasn't the case for Rosemary Kennedy, the mentally ill daughter of Joseph Kennedy Sr. and the sister of John F. Kennedy. When her father became disturbed by her mood swings, he arranged a lobotomy, and the procedure was botched, leaving her profoundly disabled and kept in an institution until her death over 60 years later. It was one of the many cases that led people to consider lobotomy a savage procedure, and it soon fell out of favor starting in the 1950s and had basically ceased by the 70s. Today, it's seen as a violation of rights of patients, with some even calling for the Nobel Prize Foundation to retroactively withdraw its award. This next one gives the new meaning to mail call, mailing children. It was the early 20th century, and the U.S. Postal Service was just getting started. In fact, it wasn't until 1913 that they even started accepting parcels over 4 pounds. Now that they didn't really put too much out there in the way of specifics. Just had to be over 4 pounds and have the proper amount of postage. You could probably send a case full of booze, at least until Prohibition, but the odds are it might show up a bottle or two short once the postmaster saw it. You could probably mail a dog or two with the proper air holes. People even used to ship industrial supplies like bricks at a lower rate than the cost of freight. But only days after it opened, one couple had an interesting idea. A couple in Ohio wanted to send their infant son to visit his grandmother about a mile away, but they couldn't get over there themselves. So instead of telling grandma they'd be over another day, they did the only sensible thing, handed their baby over to the postmaster along with 15 cents postage and some insurance money. And the baby was driven along the route until he was delivered to grandma. While it was a short, safe trip, it was a bizarre precedent for the Postal Service. It was now apparently legal to mail your child. And it wasn't long before people started planning on longer trips. While the Great Depression was still over 10 years away, many people in the era were falling on hard times, especially in the Midwest and prairie states. That meant people often had to send their children away to live with relatives, and the cost of postage on railway mail was much cheaper than passenger train, if a little less uncomfortable. Most famously, Mae Pierstroff was almost 6 years old when her parents handed her over to the Postal Service and put 53 cents worth of stamps on her coat to take her 73 miles to her grandmother's home. But it's not as shocking as it sounds. The mailman responsible for her trip was actually a family relative who made sure she got there safely. But the Postal Service knew it was a strange territory. Somehow, people got it in their minds that it was okay to mail your children, and while most of the early cases were pretty safe, the Postmaster General was not amused. A few months after Mae's strange trip in 1914, he banned postal workers from taking children as cargo. But that didn't stop people from trying, and a year later, one thrifty woman in Florida successfully mailed her 6-year-old daughter all the way to her father's home in Virginia. In 1920, 2 applications were made for mailing children, with the parents attempting to list their kids as harmless wild animals. That's going to be an awkward conversation over the dinner table. But was it truly legal once upon a time to kill a man? Dueling. Pistols at dawn. I demand satisfaction. Once upon a time, if someone was offended by another man, they could simply challenge them to a fight to the death. If both men agreed, the duel would be refereed, and whoever won by killing the other would be free to go, having proven themselves victorious in their dispute. Traditionally, duels were fought with swords and actually took the place of trials in some cases. In one famous case, a wife of a knight accused another knight of assaulting her. Her husband fought the accused in a duel, and if he lost, she would be executed for bearing false witness. In the end, her husband won and killed the accused knight, and her accusation was considered valid. And surprisingly, this was largely a privilege of the nobility. Despite the brutality of trying to kill someone to prove your guilt or innocence, it was considered something a respectable gentleman would do. Most governments tried to outlaw the practice as the Middle Ages ended, but the duels continued, and kings often threw up their hands and tried to regulate them rather than outlaw them. As Enlightenment dawned, the tide turned against the practice of dueling in much of the world, and they prided themselves on moving past that savagery. The addition of more public courts meant there was less reason to take the eye for an eye approach. The laws meant it was harder to get away with killing someone in a duel, at least in Europe. America had other ideas. The United States was a bit of a crazy place in its early days, and it didn't get much crazier than the sitting vice president killing a former cabinet official in a duel. The death of Alexander Hamilton at the hands of Aaron Burr might have been bizarre, but it wasn't unusual. In fact, Hamilton's son had been killed in a duel not long before, which might have given Hamilton a death wish. And then there was the Wild West, where it was pretty common for gunslingers to settle their disputes with shootouts while the whole town watched on. Where was the police? Well, there was a good chance one of the combatants was the town sheriff. And it went on longer than most people think. 2 future presidents even participated in duels, with Andrew Jackson killing a man in 1806 and Abraham Lincoln being challenged to a duel by the state auditor in 1842, but being talked out of it at the last second. But as the 1800s waned, dueling had been outlawed virtually everywhere. After all, if you shoot someone, it's still murder even if you both agreed to it beforehand. And the courts aren't likely to be sympathetic. Of course, one kind of dueling still remains, when that one guy insults your mom at the bar, and the next thing you know, you're brawling with your bare fists on the floor. Some things will never change, and unlike Alexander Hamilton, this kind of duel will probably just get you a night in the drunk tank. Want to know more about the oddest laws out there? Check out weird laws you're breaking every day, or watch this video instead.